Welcome to the Death of a Dream podcast. The microphone is on. We are here. I am wearing my I believe in Santa sweatshirt because December and life choices and the importance of just doing things that you enjoy, wearing things that you enjoy, and allowing yourself to be in that moment because the moment's never going to come again. So my moment today is wearing my I believe in Santa shirt. Here we are. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into our great things. You don't have to listen to mine. You can take this time to self-reflect on your own great thing. That really is however you feel like you want to navigate this moment of the podcast. But for me, my great thing really has just been the constant, ever present, and a lot of my great things have to do with this because this definitely was something that I was struggling with early on in my journey, and still struggle with, but I always find it important to celebrate the moments where I notice a major change. And I'm doing a better job of just self-regulating. I'm not completely healed. I'm not, ever. We're never over the things that have held us back in the past, but what we can do is do better at monitoring ourselves and watching, just how we're showing up and being ever present. And so for me, there are a lot of situations where I used to save myself from and save myself from experiencing the deepness of whatever's going on, right? And I could do this in a various amount of ways. Usually it would be finding space to go on my phone, finding space to just escape to the next thing. And I was kind of always looking for that next moment. And I never found myself ever wanting to be right where I was. Ever. Like, it made me super uncomfortable to fully be anywhere, because then I might be missing out on the next thing. So, definitely this last year, but potentially, the last 2 or 3 years when I started doing this work, I started to pick up on that, this idea that I just never, ever, ever was anywhere. And so this weekend I'm sitting there and I'm noticing other people's attempt at an escape, right? And I'm like, that would totally be me, right? Like, I would be finding ways to shop online, or I would be finding ways to be ready to jump to the next thing instead of just sitting there and enjoying the moment for what it was, right? I would be looking for the next stimulus of what was coming next. Like, let's go, let's make this more exciting. This is rather boring. And how can we just move past this moment of unspectacular? And this weekend I just noticed myself really just enjoying the average, the sitting, the being. And I always love to just take note of that growth. Not that I'm always there. There definitely are moments where I escape myself. And I had one of those moments this weekend too, where I was like, oh no, sitting here's not enough. We need to go do the next thing. I definitely called myself back, but not before I was trying to run out to the next thing. And right, that's a dangerous place to be. But it's just about growth. It's just about recognizing when you do go to those places and recognizing, allowing yourself to collect those clues, which inform, right, whatever that trigger is. And you can start to effectively manage yourself if there's something that you want to grow away from. And for me, I've always been trying to manage my lack of presence, right? And my lack of presence just comes from who I am. Like, I'm an Enneagram 7. We just want to run and feel good, period. We just want to feel good. We just want to be happy. That's it. And so, right, anything that isn't like the extremes of happiness and wonderful things is worth running from. And so that's including unspectacular moments. That's including just like sitting in a room with people. That's including just playing cards, like anything. Fill in the blank. It's inclusive of anything that would be seemingly unspectacular and boring. Those would be moments that I would try to escape, and not even escape to something more wonderful sometimes. Just like not allow myself to be sitting in that discomfort of not enough, not wonderful enough, not fun enough, not expansive enough. Like whatever it was just not going to be enough to fulfill me. And so really that's my great thing, like just seeing myself do it really well, right? And sit in that presence. And I find it funny that the one day where I escaped myself and I noticed that I was being triggered and I didn't self-regulate and I didn't pick up on that, and I allowed myself to kind of run a little bit and I had to rein myself back in, followed by the next day where I just fully allowed myself to sit and be present and own that moment. And so it's an ever growing and expanding expression of self. And, you can key in on whatever it is. Fill in the blank. What does it look like for you? Who do you want to show up as in that moment? What's important to you? Where do you want to be? Because presence may not be the thing that you're working on, but it definitely is mine. And so that's my great thing. Go ahead today, every day. If you can't do it every day, just find what works for you. Find where you can work this into your schedule somewhere and start getting comfortable with expressing the amazing things that you're doing. Because there are studies that show that we aren't great at doing that. And it's important that we start flexing that muscle and we start practicing. And the more that we do it, the better that we will be. And so that whole piece is just about ownership of your own greatness. It's important. And today, coincidentally, we're talking about that very topic, like the ownership of who you are and how you got here, right? And that's like such a scary, big idea because it's so inclusive of so many different factors. And what I found in my story was, first off, that this was like glaringly obnoxious and offensive. And so I would see like quotes from people and they'd be like, just go back to your past. You got to own your story, right? Like Brene Brown, thank you, because that work is so important and it's so true. But cut to Hanna 5 years ago, cut to Hanna even 3 years ago. I remember sitting in actual conferences going, okay, own your story. Yeah, I don't want to do that. And anytime that I shift into that mindset, anytime that is my gut reaction, usually it means that I have to deal with something that I'm not ready for. But if it has offended me, usually that means that we're taking the first step, right? And for me, I stayed in offensive mode for a very long time where I just kind of like hated on those things, and I would like hate whatever commercial that is. They definitely said that right. I would hate something that someone put out, but I'd share it because I'm like, yeah, you people need to own your story, right? And that's important. And I like Brene Brown, so everybody should know that because I'm like this higher being and I enjoy dreams and people think that of me. And so it's important that I keep that look up. all the while underneath, I'm just going, yeah, no, you can't own your story. And even more than that, I think it was just me kind of projecting this unwant, because here's the deal. The moment that you hand over and you fully go all in on this accountability, ownership idea of your life, all of a sudden you remove blame. And if you've lived with this victim mentality, and that's not being said as something that you should take offense to, because trust, like, I didn't realize how much of a victim I was to everything until I just started making myself be accountable, and I started to listen to the main vibe that I was putting off, and I had no idea, right? And so victim mentality would have been something that would have flared up this idea of oh no, shit, that's not me. Yeah, people should really stop being victims. Sheesh, they're so pathetic with their victimness, right? And those would be things that I would say. All the while, right, passing the buck to that's someone else's work to do, that's not me. And usually the things that glared to me and offended me the most, those were the things that now that I'm into my work, those were the things that I needed the most work with. And so for me, the biggest piece was the ownership of my own story. And going back and actually examining it, and not the pretty frilly, oh, I'm going to write down my life story and maybe I write about the one time in middle school where I got left out from the popular kids table. And maybe I write about that. And maybe that is your biggest trauma, but we're talking about going through every piece. And I like to start it because that's so broad, right? Exploring your story is so broad. I like to start with, because it's amazing how much this turns up, but I like to start with your death of a dream moment, right? And a lot of times we think that happened in college, or that happened when we had kids and it happened into adulthood. But I'm finding if we explore that, really get in there, usually it happened really early on. And along with that come narratives that we have carried and stopped a lot of different things from happening in our life because of that trauma moment where we weren't allowed to dream true to the things that we wanted to aspire to. And so when we trace back there, it's sort of telling of other things, and we can start to get comfortable with this ownership piece, right? And dreams seem to have less trauma associated with them, and not always, but sometimes they allow us to explore childhood because we're being that specific about it. It allows us to explore childhood and different points of our lives in a less scary way. But it also opens up this world of possibility of exploring our story. And maybe if we can see, right, that didn't hurt us that bad, right? We just went back there and explored it. And that kind of gives us more permission to do more of that work and start owning that story. Because here's the deal. You cannot change it. We are exactly where we are. And I know so much of that truth comes with hurt and things that we could have never prevented or helped or changed if we wanted to. But on the other side of that, there's a whole lot of growth that can happen as a result. And, incidentally, And funny enough, we just had Alyssa on our show last Friday, and she talked about this idea of, when people avoid my work, I think that that's the biggest compliment that they can pay me. And people have said that before about my work, and it truly is like a self-timing thing. Usually, if someone's work is hitting you, but only hitting you hard enough for you to be like, no, nope, and then you kind of start to tap into and cross over to, oh, yes, okay, right? And you start to take these baby steps to that place where you almost experience stages of acceptance of your own story. So even if you are in the hate, despise stage, but also mixed with some discovery, you're a step closer than you were before, right? And so your job right there is to keep exploring and keep finding the people and the things that are going to speak to you and keep you going on this path. And that's so wildly different for every single person, whether that's this podcast or a different book, or it could be a combination of things. For me, it was probably about 4 podcasts, 3 books that I can think of specifically, and just a whole lot of conversations with very important people to me, and keeping the pedal down. And this podcast definitely helped with that, right? Because I didn't have a choice. We had to keep researching. We had to keep growing. I had to keep coming back here and exploring this idea of where my dream died and all the things that went along with that. And the start of telling this story, and even more than telling it, right? Owning it. And you can escape the things that have already been written. And they're still worth writing, right? Because stories, and I wrote this morning in my journal, stories are vital. We essentially are built on a collection of stories. When you were born, you were told things about your grandparents, your parents, you, right? And stories are so specific and so true to our nature that those essentially allow us to create our own story, right? Based on what we've been told about the people and the marks of where we came from, and then what do we pull from those stories that stay true to us? And that's where you start constructing the story that you tell yourself. And whether or not the story that was told to you was good or bad or whatever, right? You clung to specific things there. And that allowed you to start writing your own story based on the one that you had kind of been told about you and about where you came from. And so if you have a story of greatness that was crafted and written beautifully and told to you, there's a chance that greatness became part of your narrative, and you maybe took more steps than most because of that conscious narrative that was preached into you. And those things are wildly important. And so, since we're the owners of that story, why don't we just tell a good story? Why don't people tell amazing stories about where they came from? Why don't we just create this whimsical, wonderful world for every child that's born so that they go out and change the world inevitably? Well, some of us don't assign greatness to those past stories, right? And I can speak specifically to mine as it was okay. I I don't know if I just wasn't listening or if those stories weren't really told to me, but I don't remember that many stories about my family before me. And so I kind of just assumed they really weren't worth telling. And so they must not have been that great. And so I probably don't have that amazing of DNA, right? Like my genetics can't really lead to anything that wonderful, because if there wasn't a story that was told, it probably wasn't worth telling. And I think, as storytelling starts to escape us because of this hustle culture, because of just the lack of storytellers, more of that storyteller generation are passing away every day. And so we're starting to lose those stories. And so much of who we tell ourselves we are early on, because we haven't crafted our own identity, really comes from the roots of our family. And so depending on what story you were told really informs early on kind of, I think, and I've been reading on psychology and different studies that have been done, but if you think about the work that was done with mothers and babies and attachment, if you think about that, the mothers who nurtured and really clung to and just loved their babies, those babies felt more comfortable going out and exploring and taking risks, essentially. And the ones who kind of had a cold upbringing, who didn't have a lot of nurturing, really feared taking those steps. And so if you take that and you apply that here, and that's like a very, very rash overview of the study. But if you take that and you apply it here and you think about how nurtured you were in the stories that you were told, right? Like, were you brought up with knowing a lot about your ancestry, knowing a lot about those stories? And because those told a story of success, because those told stories of greatness, right? You're more willing to go out and do that because you've been brought up in that environment, because you've been brought up knowing and being nurtured in a place where you can run comfortably because you know other people did it, right? And when we aren't nurtured in that place, when we aren't taken to that place, right, we're scared. We don't take risks. We don't know what's possible. And so our job becomes testing and experimenting, and that we may not do until we're more comfortable. And so, when we break all of this down, I think it really is just your ability and willingness to go back and own the fullness of your story, own everything, and own and explore. And I really just explore the things that I'm looking to grow from. Otherwise, it gets too overwhelming. So if there's something that you're really wanting to investigate, so there's like a common narrative that's been following you around, I always use the death of my dream as a really important standing point for me in the retracing, because I think it informs the narrative, right? The negative or positive narratives that we tell ourselves about who we're allowed to be, right? And from that place, we can start to rewrite, right? Because some of us are completely lost. I was and still am lost in how you continue, how you redream, rewrite, relive, right? Rediscover who you're supposed to be. Because it's not really dependent on stories of greatness, But had you had that backing, that confidence, that nurturing early on, maybe we wouldn't have created negative narratives that now inform what we think we're capable of, right? And imagine what you would have done if you hadn't started writing bad things into your life early on. And so when we go back and we trace that, right? And for me, that's what it looked like. We went back, we talked about it. We talked about the hurt that was done there. We talked about the trauma of that moment of someone speaking disbelief into my life. And those were things that I clung on to and carried with me for a very long time. And I went back, explored it, felt it all over again. And then I could really start to heal and own that moment. And while I can't change it, right, it is an amazing part of my story now, because for the next generation of people that I'm responsible for, I can tell that story of coming back, of not accepting that, and now of the importance of telling stories, whether they're great or terrible, right? There's always a lesson to be learned there. And story work, storytelling has always been super important to me. I didn't realize how the lack of story hurt me. And I know that it's just like my parents were hustling. They were hustling like the parents they had that hustled before them. And so like curling up and talking about history of a family like that just is not anything that was doable. We didn't have time. We didn't have the ability because like their parents before them hustled the same way they are. So like who's keeping this going? Nobody. And so if you don't step up and start telling it, who's going to? Who keeps that story going? And because it can really have an impact, it's important. It is a part of who you and generations after you start to inform their next move. And I believe the lack of creates a different reaction, but sometimes an equally debilitating one. We have to have stories. They are essentially the backing of our identity. And whether that's a story of greatness or a story of average, it doesn't matter. It's still a story. It's still something to hold on to. And there's always a lesson to be learned, right? Or like, is that a part of the identity that you want to hold? And does that give you backing and knowing that something like that is possible? And so I don't know. The biggest shift that you can make is in the accountability factor of what you're willing to own in your life. And you'll get there on your own time. I promise you. I promise you it's uncomfortable, but if this talk or my work or anyone's work really has been offensively speaking to you, we probably hit on something that eventually you're going to want to work on. And I understand if it's like Alyssa said, hurting you or telling you like, oh yes, I need to do this, but you're not ready. You're just not ready. And that's okay too. But that's been my biggest shift. Like just owning the fact that there's nothing that I can do to change what has happened. And so now I can change where we go from here. And be willing to tell that story, to dig up stories. And I'm working on a whole bunch of stuff with storytelling because I truly believe every single story is so worthy of telling. And it's so important that we keep those stories going to help the next generations, right? It can't stop with us. As always, you're smart, you're strong, you're beautiful. What are you going to do? Change the world.